Hi there, welcome to the Soil and Roots podcast, digging beneath the surface to uncover the hidden ideas that form us and the church and the culture. I'm Brian Fisher. This is episode 31, The 7 Habits of Highly Defective People. We're not going to actually list 7 habits today. Today's episode title is a play on words that pokes fun at our modern preoccupation with habits as the sole means to wealth and successful relationships and overall well-being. As anyone who's tried to change their character solely through changing habits can attest, it's not as easy as it looks. And certainly not as easy as some authors and book titles would have us believe. So today we're going to start exploring our second key element of spiritual formation, habits. Modern culture and Christianity are struggling today because of what Dallas Willard called the Great Omission. We talk a lot about making disciples, but struggle to actually make them. If a disciple is an apprentice of Jesus, someone whose life is centered around the journey of becoming more like him, that message may not have filtered down to many of us along the way. We've explored how a primary purpose of the church is supposed to be character formation. But as Clyde Reed explained, quote, "The churches do not change lives or influence conduct to any appreciable degree," end quote. So we may find our Christian communities populated with people who know a lot about Jesus or do good works or are faithful to the church, but not necessarily people who are so similar to Jesus that we wonder if he's actually in the room somewhere. People who are so intent on listening to our hearts, so inclined to heal, so adamant that we're worth seeing, worth gazing at, worth rescuing, that we find their love almost overwhelming. We're coming to discover that there is a difference between a modern good Christian and someone who loves so deeply, so effortlessly, so graciously. In addition to the Great Omission, we're faced with 3 other problems that are somewhat specific to our era: the forgotten kingdom, the discipleship dilemma, and the formation gap. Now, the good news is all 3 can be resolved and redeemed. And this season is all about that last one, the formation gap. It refers to the fact that human beings are formed through a combination of 5 key elements. It's just our human reality. If one human wishes to become more like another human, that process involves the same 5 elements, regardless of the people involved, or whether or not the formation is good or bad. The 5 elements are time, habit, community, intimacy, and instruction. In terms of our formation into the likeness of Jesus today, we're exploring whether we experience these elements the way the New Testament church did. And we've concluded we don't. There's a gap. Many historic Christian communities, starting with the early church, assumed and experienced all 5: relational time, specifically designed habits, intentional community, appropriate intimacy, and increasingly complex instruction as they grew to become more like Jesus. But for the most part, modern Christians don't experience some or perhaps most of these elements to any appreciable degree, and that's why we call it the formation gap. We also tend to be self-directed in our discipleship, and we may ignore the power and purpose of our own stories. We forget that discipleship is not necessarily about just learning more Christian things, it's about becoming like someone else from the inside out. Another way to look at our journey of spiritual formation is in 6 stages. We pulled these from a book called The Critical Journey. Unfortunately, most of our church institutions only guide us into and through the first 3 stages. When we hit stage 4 in the wall, we're often left by ourselves without much help or guidance. That results in discontentment, loneliness, isolation, and a lack of direction or purpose in our spiritual life. We're left to quietly wonder, is this all there is? So we're exploring how we might fill the gap, to recreate or enhance specific communities that purposefully embody all 5 elements and are ready and open to help us navigate all 6 stages. Perhaps we form them in our church, in our family, our group of friends, our neighborhoods, or maybe something entirely new. At Soil and Roots, we call these immersive communities greenhouses. Jessica and I are part of one, and it has been, in fact, the most intentional, formative, supportive community we've ever experienced. And our hearts are far better for it. And we spent some time exploring one of the most powerful and influential realities of life, ideas. This came as a bit of surprise way back in season 1. Ideas are often unconscious, hidden assumptions that sit on the bedrock of our hearts and govern who we are. They aren't so much about facts as they are experienced realities. It takes a while to wrap our minds and hearts around the concept of ideas, but we're getting there. Many of us assume that our belief systems, our statements of faith as it were, form the very core of who we are, but that isn't necessarily the case. There's another level of the human heart underneath our belief systems, and that's the realm of ideas and desires. And that's where we spend most of our time here at Soil and Roots. The roots are our hearts, and the soil is the ideas in which our hearts are planted. So we're exploring discipleship as the process by which ideas of darkness are transformed into ideas of light down in the bedrock of our hearts. And that happens as our hearts experience Jesus. Again, ideas are not really logical conclusions or sometimes not even conscious thoughts, so they aren't transformed solely by us willing them to be changed. They're primarily changed through relationship. As that happens, we begin to experience the more that the Christian life has to offer, including a deeper connection to God, others, creation, and even ourselves. We find ourselves more integrated into God and others and ourselves. And we've concluded that this life-giving formation is by far most effective and helpful when it's a community effort. Despite the fact we live in a time when the Christian faith has become largely privatized, the prevailing loneliness, isolation, disconnection that people are experiencing inside and outside the church remind us of a pivotal, inescapable fact about our humanity. We're made for community. Real, genuine community that embodies all 5 elements. And that type of community leads to greater human flourishing. So let's move on to our second element of formation, habit. Now, it's a very broad, very big topic. Mortimer Adler wrote a massive book with a title you probably assume I'd love, called The Great Ideas, and he expounded on 102 of them, one of which is habits. If you enjoy Aristotle and Augustine, I recommend reading the full essay on habits, but here are just a few summary points. Quote, just as clothes are something a person has or possesses in a manner more or less fitting the body, so habits, in a psychological sense, are qualities which a person has or possesses, and they too can be judged for their fitness, end quote. In other words, there's often a moral quality to habits, at least in the way we're defining them. And the habits we're exploring are learned. Adler continues, quote, habit is a retained effort, the result of something done or experienced, end quote. Perhaps when you were a kid, you walked your dog and you discovered you loved it. So you now have a habit of walking your dog. But perhaps as a kid, you were bitten or attacked by a dog. So your habit now is to cross the street if you see one. The habits we're exploring are primarily the result of experiences and relationships, meaning the habits we formed back in our stories. So here's a very simple definition of habits in our Soil and Roots lingo. A habit is simply a repeated pattern of our 8 Heartview indicators. We talked about the 8 indicators back in season 2. There's a simple picture that illustrates Heartview and our 8 indicators on the resources tab at soilandroots.org. I invite you to pull it up. It's free. You can download it. You can see the 8 indicators there and how they interact with our hearts. Our hearts bubble up their true ideas and desires through our thought patterns, our emotions, our behaviors, our words, our relationships, our health, and how we use time and money. We all have certain repeated patterns of how we think about God, others, ourselves, how we engage with creation and culture. Our emotions tend to follow certain repeated patterns, how we feel about God and other relationships. We have all sorts of habits related to our speech, our spoken words, not just what we say, but how we say it, and even what we don't say. Our habits include repeated actions or behaviors. We discover habits in who we form relationships with, and how those relationships progress, or who we don't form relationships with. And we have repeated patterns related to our health, and how we treat time and money. So, for example, we may find ourselves to be a pessimistic thinker. That's a pattern. Maybe we tend to initially evaluate people and events through a critical lens. We may have a habit of developing relationships, but with seductive, exploitative people. We may have a habit of spending money to cope with pain and anxiety. We may unconsciously fill up our days with tasks and activities and meetings and stuff because we feel we have the emotion of guilt if we spend too much time in so-called downtime. So when we talk about Heartview and habits that characterize a deep disciple, we're talking about a pretty comprehensive perspective on how a person typically operates in the world. And because a disciple is someone whose life is ordered around becoming like Jesus, we want to compare our habits with the habits of Jesus, as well as the habits of those of his closest friends. And we journey together in our communities and the greenhouses to transform our habits into his habits. Sorry for the double negative here, but we don't develop good or bad habits for no reason. In other words, our habits don't form by themselves. Back to the dog, we walk our dog because we enjoy it. It's good for the dog. But if a dog bit us as a child, we may scurry away when we see one because we want to avoid being hurt again. There are reasons in our history for our current habits. Also, we don't sin for no reason. We often miss this in modern Christianity. We acknowledge our sin and we chalk it up to the fact that we're all sinners. That's true. But stopping there also stops the process of discovery and potential healing and transformation. Yes, we're sinners, but what desires and ideas on the bedrock of our hearts persuade us to sin? What do we love that's tempting us to sin? What harmful wounds may be leading us to harm others? On the flip side, we also obey for good reason. We have good habits because of whom we love. Another way to define habits is the way some ancient writers did virtues and vices. When our habits align with ideas of light, those are virtues. When our habits align with ideas of darkness, well, those are vices. Virtues and vices are both there for reasons. Generally because of past experiences and relationships, because of our stories. So habits are tied directly and tightly to what we truly love and to those hidden ideas that shape those loves. So habits and Heartview go hand in hand. We can tell, based on evaluating the repeated patterns of our 8 indicators, what and whom our hearts desire and the ideas that form us, what forms the reasons our habits exist. Well, let's take a look at an age-old question regarding habits. Is our heart formed by adopting new habits, or do our habits change as a result of a transformed heart? Is this the chicken or the egg? Can we change our desires and hidden ideas by simply changing our habits, or do our habits change as a result of a heart that's been transformed? When I was back in college, I attended a Christian conference up in Pittsburgh, and the keynote speaker was Tony Campolo, somewhat controversial sociologist and professor in the Christian world at the time. He told the story of counseling a man who claimed he was no longer in love with his wife, and the guy asked Campolo to affirm that he should leave and divorce her. If I remember the story correctly, Campolo said, "Yes, you can leave her, but not until you've done this first. I want you to make a list of 50 things you did for your wife when you first fell in love. Then for the next month, go do those things. Come back after that, and we'll talk." The man groaned and complained, but he agreed. Well, a month later, he returned. He had made the list and had done the things he did when he first fell in love with his wife. As a result, he had fallen back in love with his wife. He no longer wanted the divorce. He was now a happily married man. His habits changed his heart. Well, there's another famous Tony Horton, the exercise guru. That guy's in his mid-60s now, but he looks like he's 25. Do you want to look like Tony Horton? Well, just follow his workout and nutritional habits. I tried one of his routines for a while back in my 30s, and I almost died. His habits did not change my heart. In fact, they almost stopped it. So how do we contrast the first Tony with the second Tony? In one case, habits changed the heart. In the other, they most certainly did not. If there are only 7 habits of highly effective people, and all we have to do is do them, why aren't we all highly effective? More seriously, what about people struggling with addictive habits who enter AA or Celebrate Recovery or some inpatient or outpatient treatment center only to ultimately lose their battle with addiction? We seem to know the right habits to suggest to overcome addiction, but sometimes our desires and habits just don't get on the same page. Many people recover, but some don't. So which is it? Do habits change hearts, or do hearts change habits? Well, as with many things related to the complexities of being human, the answer seems to be both. I've joked before with you that for my entire adult life, I've bounced up and down in a 25-pound range. When I'm heavier, I force myself into good habits and I lose some weight. Then I rediscover the joys of frozen custard and chicken fingers, and I desire the pleasure those give me more than being thin, and so up in the hot air weight balloon I go again. The reality is that I don't always want to be healthier as much as I want to experience the pleasure of certain foods, and not just in moderation. If I could eat frozen custard in moderation, I'd be able to maintain a healthy weight. But when I desire frozen custard, I desire the entire store. John Stonestreet and Brett Kunkle wrote a book on how to raise Christian kids in an increasingly hostile culture, and they discuss virtue and vice, good habits and bad habits. Quote, Aristotle, in his work on ethics, taught that the head was the seat of reason and the belly was the seat of passion or desire. Virtuous people rule the belly with the head, and Aristotle thought that could be done solely through habit. Habit helps, but we've all experienced the war that can take place between what we know and what we want. Often the belly wins. That's why C.S. Lewis thought that the head needed help. To master our passions, we need the moral will. Lewis called this the chest, end quote. They're referring to a famous quote where C.S. Lewis called men who lacked conviction men without chests. They lacked the will. Okay, so sometimes the ideas and desires in my heart can form to be more like Jesus simply by doing the things Jesus did. By practicing the things he did, we can become more like him. Our hearts can, in fact, grow to be more like him just by perfecting habits. But it may require something more than our intellect and rationalization, and something more than our bellies, our desires. We may need a stronger will. And yet, we've probably heard stories of people who came to Christ and were immediately delivered from some bad habits: drugs, smoking, alcoholism, pornography. Once they began to desire Christ, the desire for those other things just immediately melted away. A heart change immediately resulted in immediate habit change. Gosh, wouldn't we all like that to be the norm? Okay, so here's what we've concluded so far. Habits are simply repeated patterns of our 8 Heartview indicators. So the patterns of how we think, behave, treat money, etc., related to God and others, ourselves, and even creation. As deep disciples, we identify our current habits and we compare them to the habits of Jesus. If there's a mismatch, we want to determine how our dark habits may be formed into his habits. That's the essence of Heartview. Changing our habits may be as simple as just beginning to do the things Jesus did. We should have a healthy expectation that if we do more of those things, they will become habit and our hearts will eventually follow suit. Our ideas and desires may well change. But we recognize that is not a universal principle. Sometimes heart change may need to come first for our habits to permanently change. And we also recognize there's an ebb and flow to this. We're going to have ups and downs. We're going to have good days and bad days. Welcome to being human. In the case where simply trying to do better doesn't work, how do we develop our chests? How do our hearts develop the will to repeatedly do the things Jesus did? Well, this is where I'm going to depart from some authors and thinkers. Some folks repeat the necessity of just getting back up and doing the same things over and over and over again until it somehow becomes a permanent habit and the heart changes. I'm going to propose that when simply doing the right habits doesn't change the heart and we move from virtue back to vice, trying to just gut it out over and over again may not actually be a solution. Matter of fact, it may end up just frustrating us. Perhaps developing our will, developing our chest, is a matter of integrating the other 4 key elements of formation. That we look at habit formation holistically, not just doing the habit, but incorporating it with our relational time in an intentional community with confessional and appropriate intimacy and continued deepening instruction. Sometimes even our habits are more caught than taught. Like I've said before, there's a whole lot we can learn from AA. Not that everyone who enters AA conquers their addiction, but they have a fairly deep grasp on what it means to be human and this key element of habits. We can't escape the necessity of authentically engaging our stories. If we look at discipleship as a lifelong journey into all 4 relationships, I think modern Christianity is weakest in embracing our relationship with self and creation. We may be stuck in various vices, and no amount of trying to do better is helping. That could well be an invitation to dig into our hearts and our stories to deal with woundedness and harm there. but in a safe, trusted environment. I'll finish by illustrating this with a story. Most of the stories I share here are from my own life, primarily because I'm just terrible at sharing other people's stories. So a few episodes ago, we explored that a deep disciple is present in time. When we're with someone, we're with someone. We're attuned to their hearts, not just their words. This is also an example of a habit. We can develop the habit, we can practice being attuned to someone in the time that we're with them. Now, I'm practicing this habit because this has been an area of struggle for me. I'm phenomenally good at listening to someone just for the purpose of responding to them, rather than actually listening to their hearts. For all the times I'm not present with other people, I did get one interaction right recently. I was flying back to Dallas from Detroit a few months ago. That's about a 2.5-hour flight. I'm an introvert, so when I fly, my habit is to find my seat, immediately put on my headphones, and start reading or pretending I'm asleep or watching a movie. Pretty much anything that signals to the other people in my row that I'm unavailable. It's a bit harder to do when you get a middle seat, and on this flight, I got a middle seat. So I found my seat, and the woman sitting at the window had obviously listened to this podcast because she had her earphones in and was pretending to be asleep. So far, so good. But as I sat down, before I could put in my earbuds, the woman on the aisle engaged me in conversation. And you know how this goes. I immediately knew I was going to be busy for the next 2.5 hours. As it turns out, she was delightful. We chit-chatted about our families, where we're from, politics. And then I realized that this would be a great place to practice the habit of being present. Could I tune in to see if I could hear her heart and not just the polite chit-chat? So I put my book away, put my headphones aside, and as I attuned to her, I realized she was pretty lonely. She's a wife and a mother, but her husband works all the time and travels, and her kids were entering their teenage years and no longer particularly interested in her, and she was experiencing that loss. She mentioned she had once worked for a church, so I asked her what her religion was. She was Russian Orthodox. I'm a fairly curious person, so I started asking her questions about Russian Orthodoxy because I don't know much about it. At one very natural point in the conversation, I asked her how someone in the Russian Orthodox Church becomes reconciled to God. My new friend clearly understood sin, so how does someone become restored to God in that state? She laughed out loud and immediately replied, "They suffer." I asked, "What do you mean?" She said, "We suffer. That's how we're saved. Our people have suffered and suffered for years, so we come back to God through our suffering." That was fascinating, resulted in a half-hour, very vibrant dialogue on grace, salvation, the kingdom, and that although we do suffer, we aren't saved through our suffering. Our salvation is a free gift from our loving Father. A loving Father who created her, deeply values her, and wants nothing more than to be with her. She was stunned. What I had shared with her was an idea so radically different from the ideas in her heart, she wasn't sure what to do with it. She actually said out loud, "I've never heard that. I'm not even sure what to do with that. I think I just need to think about it." We talked about the kingdom a bit more, and then the conversation naturally drifted into some other things. We exchanged emails and then got off the plane. Had I been my usual self, someone not always attuned to listening to someone's heart, the conversation probably would have gone very differently. But God graciously reminded me of this new habit I'm working to form, so I tried it out, and it worked out pretty well. Look, discipleship is a journey. Sometimes wholesale changes are good and right, but most often God gently moves us in a direction as we become more attuned to Him. Deep discipleship is intentional, but that certainly doesn't mean it's all at once. So let's relax, breathe, and maybe just pick one or two things we've learned so far and try them out. You just never know what God might do with one small step. Thanks for listening. Hey, if you enjoy the podcast, give it a great rating and some comments on your favorite podcast platform. Helps us out a ton. You can join our community on Facebook at Soul and Roots Podcast, and you can always reach out to us directly at fish@soulandroots.org. And we'll see you next time.